رحم الله من دعا سورة المباركة الفاتحة. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله بارئ الخلائق الأجمعين، باعث الأنبياء والمرسلين، ثم الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء، حبيب قلوبنا وشفيع ذنوبنا أبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. ثم الصلاة والسلام على أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين، لا سيما ولي الله الحجة ابن الحسن صاحب الأمر والزمان. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. روحي وأرواح العالمين له الفداء، ولعنة الله على أعدائهم وعلى منكري فضائلهم من الأولين والآخرين إلى قيام يوم الدين. آمين رب العالمين. أما بعد، قال الله تعالى في محكم كتابه الحكيم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وكونوا مع الصادقين. صدق الله العلي العظيم وآمنا به. نوروا مجالسكم بذكر محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجه. أما بعد، أحبائي, we are gathered here tonight to commemorate the martyrdom, the istishhad, the master of this madhab, the leader of the madhab to which the teachings of Rasulullah are attributed to in regards to conveyance and an extension of this divine deen sent upon Rasulullah, protected and conveyed and expanded by Maulana Imam Jaafer ibn Mohamed Sadiq salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil faraja. When it comes to the ma'rifah of Imam Sadiq, or aspects of ma'rifah of this ma'soom Imam, and as you know, I will surpass this muqaddimah and inshallah present it as an entire lecture in this coming Shahrul Muharram, inshallah. But as you may already know from the books of Kalam, that having ma'rifah of an Imam is wajib. And in fact, it is an asal from the usuluddin, and the validity of all aspects of furu'uddin are contingent upon the right belief of usuluddin. And the asal from usuluddin is imama, hence ma'rifah of imamah, ma'rifat of the function of imamat, number one, and ma'rifah of the individual 12 imams becomes a shart and a condition for the validity of our actions that are manifested within the parameters of furu'uddin. For as we travel on this journey of the ma'rifah of Imam Sadiq, ruhi lahul fida, it is important for us to understand certain aspects that surrounded and governed the functions of imamat, which he executed as a divinely ordained task. Number one, Imam Sadiq salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayh is known as Sheikhul A'imma. The Sheikh, yani the elderly Sheikh of the A'imma, outside of Imam Sahib al-Amri wa Zaman Ruhi lahul Fida, and outside of the Imam who is in Ghaibah, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam had the longest serving lifespan from the 11 Imams, where he attained martyrdom at the age of 65. And you find before Imam Sadiq alayhi salam from Al-Baqir and As-Sajjad and Sayyid al-Shuhada and Imam Hassan al-Mujtaba, Amir al-Mu'mineen. They never attained the age of 65. They go in martyrdom before the age of 65. And similarly, after Imam Sadiq from Al-Qadhi and Al-Rida and Al-Jawad and Al-Hadi and Al-Askari, Ruhi lahum al-Fida, none of them lived to this age of 65 that was afforded or that was granted to Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. This is one point. And you find that there is a reason and there is a deep historical truth behind even the ages of the deaths or the martyrdoms of every one of the Imams. They had reached certain achievements by a certain age, such that it seemed or it was deemed as a threat, their life and their existence was deemed as a threat to the opposition. And this becomes magnified when you apply this concept to the age of Imam al-Jawad Ruhi lahul Fida, who was martyred at the tender age or at the youthful age, the blooming age of in his 20s. For having said this, Shaykh al-A'immah Imam Jaafer ibn Mohamed al-Sadiq Ruhi lahul Fida, you find that his imamate was marked by a very peculiar circumstance, in that the Ma'soom Imam began to undertake and execute the office of divine Imamah at a very sensitive political period. And this was at a time where the empire of Bani Umayyah was declining and coming to an end. And on the other hand, it was marked with the rise of Bani Abbas. And this was not a peaceful transition of governments. It was a government where you have Bani Abbas by way of military coup, or by way of a military revolution, I should say. By way of military revolution, are attempting to dethrone Bani Umayyah. And as you are familiar with world history and global politics, the decline of a dictatorial regime, the end of a dictatorial regime when it is either replaced by another tyrannic regime or by another so-called democratic process or by foreign intervention, you will always see that the end of a tyrannical regime will always be accompanied with mass bloodshed. And on the other hand, when you have the rise of a new government, Yani Bani Abbas, when you have the rise of a new government, which is also dictatorial in nature, you will see that they will also resort to mass violence, as particularly when they attempt to establish their authority over the masses and establish their power and their range over the functions of government. So imagine Imam Sadiq alayhi salam in this environment where you have one dictatorial regime by the name of Bani Umayyah, whose decline is imminent. They are faced with a military revolution, and to hang on to any fiber of power that may remain or any fighting chance for them to survive, they are engaged in mass bloodbaths. And on the other hand, you have Bani Abbas who are trying to establish their government and establish their force and their rule, who are also orchestrating and commanding mass genocides on one end. And in between this chaos, you have Maulana Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. For when you look at this, and you look at the stance of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, and the manner in which he conducted himself, and the manner that he planned out the execution of this manhaj of truth, ideological truth, you take a step back and you see that in this scenario, what were the options of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam? Imam Sadiq, and this ahibai, this thought process allows us to understand and to evaluate political and theocratic theory and theocratic rule of governance, even in this day and age. What were the choices that Imam Sadiq alayhi salam had in front of him? Number one, Bani Umayyah, their dhulm was apparent and well known. Killers of Sayyid al-Shuhada and the killers of Imam Hassan al-Mujtaba after Karbala. Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, number one, as an option, could have supported Bani Abbas as the replacement regime to Bani Umayyah. He could have advocated for Bani Abbas. But you find Imam Sadiq alayhi salam didn't do that. In fact, he discouraged and commanded his followers to remain silent and to take a neutral stance in this war of dunya, which was taking the libas and the garb of Islam, lest people are deceived by false causes and lives unnecessarily lost. Wahid. On the other hand, you could have had Imam Sadiq alayhi salam say that Bani Abbas are also tyrannical in nature. Bani Umayyah are also tyrannical in nature. Then Imam Sadiq alayhi salam could have been his own independent political party, and representing the true teachings of Ali Muhammad, he could have gone forward and gone and contested for government. Imam Sadiq alayhi salam could have done that. As it is, the supporters of Bani Abbas were riding and capitalizing on the slogan, vengeance for Karbala. There is no one greater of that vengeance outside of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. So Imam Sadiq alayhi salam could have been an independent political party and a theocracy to go and contend for rulership over the Muslim world. But you find Imam Sadiq alayhi salam didn't do that. And perhaps one immediate consequence of this happening is that the front running of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, or anyone related to Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, would have given the enemies an opportunity to unite against the common opposition, placing Bani Abbas and Bani Umayyah within the same ranks. And now you have two forces of dhulm that are fighting against each other but are now combined to come and tackle you. This is against hikmah. For you find Ba'ad, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam also knew that supporting Bani Abbas from Ilmul Ghaib was the wrong party to support and the wrong theology to support, because in essence, the hukum and the rule that they were looking for was a rule of the dunya, with the religion being an excuse. And from here we understand the ahibai, that hukum, rule and government and position of power is only beneficial if it can be used to propagate the true teachings of Ali Muhammad, if it is able to propagate the true aqidah of Ali Muhammad. But if power and position and government comes at the expense of diluting or sacrificing the teachings of Ali Muhammad, sacrificing the aqidah, the true aqidah of tashayyu', then that government is worth nothing. In the words of Amir al-Mu'minin alayhi salam, where he says, for me this government is less worth than this slipper that I'm trying to mend that is worth nothing. For you find that within this context, Imam Sadiq ruhillahul fida, as both governments are clashing, one on a decline and one on a raise, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam chooses the approach of education, and he embarks upon a manhaj through ilm that he is able, number one, to revive, number two, to preserve, and number three, to spread the true teachings of Rasulullah and the wilayah of Maulana Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. And these three approaches, in terms of revival, in terms of preservation, and number three, in terms of expansion, was to ensure that the wilayah of Ali Muhammad does not only spread during the lifetime of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, but he sets the foundations for the principles of guidance for eternity until Yawmul Qiyamah. For when a Ma'soom Imam plans the manhaj in terms of executing his responsibility of Imamah, the Ma'soom Imam's primary concern is not focused around the short term. Abadan. It is focused around the existence of man, such that those teachings are beneficial and will be a source of guidance, as we said, for generations to come until Yawmul Qiyamah. For having said this, you find that one of the critical roles of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, we will expand on two of these critical roles that Imam Sadiq alayhi salam executed as part of this office of divine Imamah. Number one, Ahibba'i, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam propagated, advocated and encouraged the upholding of the mourning ceremonies of Sayyid al-Shuhada Aba Abdullah al-Husayn al-Madloom al-Maqtul bi-Ardi Karbala. And you find that Imam Sadiq alayhi salam was born during the time of Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salam. And Imam Sadiq Ruhi Lahul Fida lived for the first 12 years of his life under the guardianship of his grandfather Imam Sajjad. For Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, from a young age, witnessed the effects of Karbala in the manner that Imam Sajjad alayhi salam wept for every day for those 34 years or 40 years after Karbala. Imam Sadiq alayhi salam was witness to the azar and the grief of Imam Zainul Abidin. Imam Zainul Abidin being that in today's terms and terminology, one of the few surviving victims of this tragedy of Karbala, first-hand witnesses. If you're to look at it from this materialistic perspective, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam noticed, absorbed, and saw the upholding of this grief and the tears and the commemoration of Imam Sajjad. And Imam Sadiq alayhi salam himself went on above and beyond to ensure that he spread the message of Imam al-Hussein, and he went above and beyond to encourage the Shias of Ali Muhammad to uphold the commemoration of Sayyid al-Shuhada at any expense. You find that you were to go through classical texts that speak about the fiqh of the ziyarah of Sayyid al-Shuhada, texts such as Kamilu Ziyarat, and outside of Kamilu Ziyarat, you will find that perhaps if not the minimum 80% of hadith that speak about the importance of ziyarah, the importance of weeping over Imam al-Hussein, the importance of a majlis of Imam al-Hussein, you will find 80% at the minimum of these hadith have emanated from Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. And this shows you the importance of the matter, such that we even have hadith when it comes to show you the centrality and the importance of upholding the ziyarah of Imam al-Hussein and the commemoration of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. They would come to Imam al-Sadiq and they would say to him, Yabna Rasulullah, we fear that if we go to Karbala, that the tyrannical regimes might spot us and might execute and kill us because of our affiliation with Imam al-Hussein. You find at that point Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam comes with hadith that advocates the multiplicity of the rewards for a person who endures difficulty or death in the way of ziyarah. Allahu Akbar. The ziyarah, the thawab of the ziyarah of Imam al-Hussein is grand. But when it came to enduring suffering or enduring possible death during ziyarah, instead of Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam telling the people, preserve your lives or retract these statements, Imam Sadiq went forward and this grand thawab that it is for ziyarah magnified it even more than what can be perceived by the mind. And within this is a statement that the ziyarah, the commemoration of Imam al-Hussein, is an institution greater than life. For people who want to make the books of history as legends in the eyes of Ali Muhammad, the commemoration of Ashura is greater than their own existence. In fact, they seek fana in this commemoration of Imam al-Hussein. Keep this in mind of the context in the age in which we live and the circumstances that surround us, Ahibbai. For you find that Imam Sadiq Ruhi Lahul Fida, number one, advocated and persevered on the importance of the entire Islamic Ummah to uphold the commemoration and the azan of Imam al-Hussein. And ahna, we're on the doorsteps of Shahr Muharram. So it becomes important and it is appropriate at this time for us to sit down and to strategize and to plan the manner in which we wish to serve Sayyid al-Shuhada. Find the khutaba and the ulama, begin their research, their studies, those finalize and go the extra mile in their service, preparing for the service and explaining the principles and the values for which Imam al-Hussein was shaheed. You find with the Nawha Khans, the Marsiya Khans, they begin to train their voices and perfect their kalam in readiness and preparing for the arrival of this grand time. Similarly, everybody else within the logistical field and tabarruk and so on and so forth. Hi, Wahid. Number two, you find that from the achievements of Imam al-Sadiq Ruhi Lahul Fida was that the Imam, by way of his university, by way of his madrasa and his teachings, Imam Jaafer ibn Mohamed al-Sadiq Ruhi Lahul Fida was responsible for nurturing and raising a generation of scholars. A generation of scholars who had not only attained the pinnacle of ilm within their respective fields, but ulama who were opposition to the establishment of the time. This in itself, Ahibbai, is a feat and a half to achieve. Number one, to raise and nourish, not 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, but to train and nourish thousands of ulama. And each one of these ulama are at the pinnacle of ilm within their fields. This in itself is an achievement. But in addition to this, these ulama now became the front face of the opposition to the tyrannical establishments of the day. And you know, prior to this movement of Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam in this formalized manner, and even you see this today because history repeats itself, these scholars were nothing but puppets of the establishment, puppets of the government. Their fatwas would change as per the interests of the government. Their fatwas would be delivered as per the commands received by the tyrant sitting at the position of government. Because over here, religion is used as the justification and the validity for the people who are in power. So if they have come into power on the basis of religion, the next natural step in the eyes of the dictator is to control the mechanisms that propagate religion. Because so long as that is under control, their rule is safe. This is what happened after Saqifa. This is what happened with Bani Umayyah, where Muawiyah started paying the scholars to go and fabricate hadith, paying scholars to negate the hadith of Amir al-Mu'mineen, paying scholars, Ibn Abbas, this Bani Abbas Afwan, and we spoke about them, the author of Bukhari, Sahih Bukhari, yani Bukhari himself, and the author of Sahih Muslim, and Ahmad ibn Hanbal, how these were people that were paid and promoted by Bani Abbas to go out and to preach their version of Islam. So you find across time these ulama were puppets, and this is not anything new. This is even in the previous religions, and this in itself is a lecture of its own. The corruption of the ulama in that they would create, negate, and deliver fatwas based on the taste of those who are in power, to secure the best interests of those people who are in power. You find this happens even today. And not necessarily it has to happen at a governmental level. There are very many establishments, religious establishments outside of government that also dictate these sorts, whether they are local, regional, so on and so forth. For example, for a person to preserve a seat on a member, the fatwas or the content would be in accordance to the taste and the likings of those people that control the member. Subhanallah. You find Imam Sadiq alayhi salam raised this generation of ulama that would come out as oppositions towards the establishment. And you find that this is a munasib to Bain al-Qawsayn, to put things into perspective. You find that the Maraja and the ulama of Najaf al-Ashraf adopted the same teachings of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam in Iraq. They are the slaves of Imam Sadiq to begin with. As two powers and two dictatorial regimes were fighting for power, what did Imam Sadiq alayhi salam do? He didn't support any one of them. He didn't put his own independent political party. Rather, what he did is, he said, we secure ilm and we secure aqidah and we nourish ulama who will go forward and spread the true deen through the true teachings. Same thing with the ulama and the Maraja of Najaf al-Ashraf. The fall of Saddam, with the tyrannical regime that was falling, in order to cling to any chance of power, how much bloodshed was spilled, how many bloodbaths were there. And on the other hand, there is foreign intervention and foreign interference to set up a new interim government that would be the new face of Iraq. So you have one corrupt regime looking to come into power. For them to establish their power, how much bloodshed was there? How much bloodbath there was? And in all this chaos, what was the stance of the Hawza Ilmiya and Najaf, the Maraja? The Maraja stance was first and foremost secure the Hawza Ilmiya. Fortify the Hawza Ilmiya with teachers and with students and this resurgence of fountain of ilm. The natija of this is that the Hawza Ilmiya became the foundation for the spread of tashayyu and the teachings of Ali Muhammad at a rate and in a manner that has been unprecedented in history. 30 million people visit Imam al-Hussein in Arba'in. How many millions of Shia lives have been transformed? This is from the planning of the Hawza Ilmiya, and they are but slaves of Imam al-Sadiq to follow in the steps and the teachings and the manhaj of Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam. To the extent that even when ISIS was to take over the entire Iraq, who came forward with the fatwa and the pure establishment of the Hashd al-Sha'bi, and it was sacrifices from the Hawza Ilmiya themselves. The teachers themselves and students themselves would go into the front line before the masses and the people. The Hawza then became the foundation of opposition towards the tyrannical regime or any corrupt regime that you find there. For within this army of ulama that Imam Sadiq Ruhillahul Fida raised, not only to spread the deen but to be an opposition towards the establishment, there are two scholars from the students of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam that I would like to describe for you, and inshallah we are able to seek inspiration from them. All of this with the salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil faraja. The book for reference or the text of reference, Ahibai, is the text by the name of Muntaha al-Amal, authored by Allama Sheikh Abbas al-Qummi, rahmatullah alayhi, author of Mafatihul Jinan. This is volume 2. Under the chapter of the companions of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. One of the companions of Imam Sadiq by the name of Aban ibn Taghlab. Aban ibn Taghlab. Look at the description of Aban ibn Taghlab. وَجَاءَ فِي كِتَابِ الْخُلَاصَةِ. In book of Khulasa, Sheikh Abbas al-Qummi reiterates and reports of this in Muntaha al-Amal, that وَقَدْ قَالَ لَهُ الْإِمَامَ الْبَاقِرِ عَلَيْهِ السَّلَامِ. مَا مَعْنَاهُ, Yani Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam said to Aban ibn Taghlab, who was the students of Imam Baqir and Imam Sadiq. Look at what Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam said to him. اجلس في المسجد وأفت الناس فإني أحب أن أرى بين شيعتي مثلك. He said to Aban ibn Taghlab, sit in the mosque and I wish you to give fatwas to the people. Allah. Does a person give fatwas in the presence of a Masum, Imam, Taqleed? Shufu. Ijlis fil masjid wa aftin nas, and deliver fatwas to people. Deliver verdicts to people. فَإِنِّي أُحِبُّ أَنْ أَرَى بَيْنَ شِيعَةِ مِثْلَكَ. For indeed, I love to see Shi'as like yourself in this position. Number one, this hadith shows you the history of Taqleed, emanated from the time of the Ma'soom Imams while they were not in Ghaibah. Number two, this shows you that the concept of Taqleed in terms of the concept of fatwas is not jurisprudential decrees or theological decrees based on opinion or self-understanding. Rather, the accurate conveyance of the words and the meanings of Ali Muhammad behind their words. Aban ibn Taghlab was distrusted. Aftin nas, meaning give fatwas to the people. Yani convey our teachings because you have understood them and are able to explain it to the people. Aywa. Aban ibn Taghlab was a master in which fields? Ilm tafsir, number one, tafsir of the Quran, wal hadith, wal fiqh, wal lugha, wal nahu. Aban ibn Taghlab was a master in tafsir of Quran, the hadith of Ali Muhammad in terms of the authenticity of hadith and the meanings and the derivation from the content of the hadith. And he was a master in fiqh, jurisprudence, the manner in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is worshipped, and in language and in grammar. As you know, Arabic grammar plays a central role in the tafsir of the Quran. In fact, tafsir of the Quran is not possible if a person does not have this command over the rules of Arabic grammar, because each and every one of these have a implication on that tafsir of the Quran. This is one. Number two, Ahibai, a scholar by the name of Hariz ibn Abdullah as-Sajistani. Sheikh Abbas al-Qummi goes on to say, Min mashahir ashab al-Sadiq alayhi salam, from one of the most famous companions of Imam al-Sadiq. وَلَهُ كُتُبْ فِي الْإِبَادَاتِ مِنْهَا كِتَابُ الصَّلَاةِ. Hariz ibn Abdullah as-Sajistani, being the most popular, most famous student of Imam al-Sadiq, number one, look at the type of scholars that Imam al-Sadiq has raised. And this is supposed to be a model of emulation and inspiration for us. Number one, he was an author. He had written multiple books and texts in regards to rules and regulations of the deen from the hadith of Ali Muhammad. By the way, before we move on to Hariz, one of the outstanding qualities of Abani bin Thaglab is that he had memorized 30,000 narrations from Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. 30,000. Hariz was an author. He had written many books in regards to the acts of worship. One of them was Kitab al-Salat. And this book, Kitab al-Salat, it goes on to say, وَهُوَ مَرْجَعُ الْأَصْحَابِ وَمَوْضِعُ الْإِعْتِمَادِ وَالشُّهْرَةِ. It wasn't any normal book in regards to the rules and the spiritual values and the philosophy of worship. It was not a normal book, rather it was a primary source of reference for other scholars to come down the line. There is a difference when you write a book on Salat, which becomes a general book for the general public to read and to be inspired by. That type of a book is written with a certain chronology, with a certain type of language for a certain audience. Hariz ibn Abdullah as-Sajistani wrote a book in terms of the rules, regulations, adab, akhlaq, and the philosophy of ibadat and salat as a primary source for other scholars attaining the pinnacle of ilm within their division. Taba'an, this type of writing, this type of language, the depth, it changes. It becomes more interesting. Number one, he was a writer. Ba'ad, he goes on to say, وَكَانَ يُسَافِرْ إِلَى السَّجِسْتَانِ لِلتِّجَارَةِ فَاشْتَهَرَ بِالسَّجِسْتَانِ. Abdullah ibn Hariz al-Sajistani was actually, by profession, he was a trader. So it is not that he was an alim of Ali Muhammad and a scholar of Imam al-Sadiq who didn't have a life, in our words. Yani didn't have a life, and there is nothing that he did except that he sat in the four walls of the masjid and gained ilm and sat next to Imam al-Sadiq. La, people who have lives, people who have families. Abdullah ibn Hariz was a trader, and a very successful trader who would often travel to Sajistan. Sajistan is the name given to an area that marks the border of present-day Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. So, Hariz ibn Abdullah as-Sajistani was originally from Kufa. He was a Kufan, but because of how he would travel to Sajistan, he was given the title of Sajistani. Not only was he a scholar for the students of Ali Muhammad, not only was he a trader, which means he's got a day job and he's got a business and all the tensions that come with running a business, especially if you're traveling from Kufa to Sajistan, which allows you to understand in our terminology, in the business or in the industry of imports and exports, those who are in such type of trades know the tension and the difficulty and how time consuming it is to manage such a business. Despite that, he ran his own import-export business, but he learned from Imam Sadiq and wrote texts that became reference for other scholars. In addition to this, the books of Rijal go on to say, وَقَدْ خَرَجَ بِالسَّيْفِ لِقِتَالِ الْخَوَارِجِ فِي السَّجِسْتَانِ فِي أَحْدِ الصَّادِقِ عَلَيْهِ السَّلَامِ. In addition to being a student of Imam Sadiq, in addition to being a scholar of Ali Muhammad, in addition to being an author, in addition to running a successful business, he even came out as a brave warrior to protect the people of Sajistan against those Khawarij during the time of Imam Sadiq, group of people who propagated the validity of the bloodshed of the followers of Ali Muhammad. To understand the kamal of the teacher, you look at the kamal of the student. Even though when it comes to a ma'sum and the imam, there is no comparison between teacher and student aslan. But this is from the fruits of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. Look at the character of the scholars that he nourished. Hariz ibn Abdullah as-Sajistani, scholar, author, successful businessman, and a warrior. And within this, Ahibba'i, comes our role and our responsibilities. As we commemorate the Shahada of Imam al-Sadiq and we say we are Jaafari. But there is a difference in the claim when we say we are Ja'afari and when somebody like Abdullah ibn Hariz al-Sajistani says he's Ja'afari. And I say this to myself before to anyone else. Work and business cannot be an excuse to not serve Ali Muhammad, because Abdullah ibn Hariz al-Sajistani will be a hujjah over me on the day of judgment. If you had to earn rizq, even I was earning rizq. Being a scholar does not contradict with earning rizq that is halal. Number 3, being a scholar in terms of having the ability to be an author and an ability to trade, even though they're two specializations of their own. What is needed is that in addition to this, you are courageous enough to be a warrior as well. 3 traditionally unrelated fields. Imam Sadiq nurtured students that they become the pinnacle in all 3 of them. In fact, Abdullah ibn Hariz al-Sajistani, as a warrior, was so fierce in protecting the Shias of Ali Muhammad. Later on, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam himself personally had to take initiatives to help Abdullah ibn Hariz al-Sajistani to go into asylum and for him to hide his personality from the people, to go into pretty much into hiding as a preservation of his life and his work and his texts. These are the sacrifices and these are the type of people that were nourished from the mothers of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, through whom we have received deen and who are going to be a hujjah over us on the day of judgment. They become a model of inspiration for all of us, inshallah. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
Ahibba'i, with the rise of ilm through the leadership of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, as Bani Abbas become more and more stable in their leadership in this tyrannical government, they began to see the threat of Imam Sadiq. Because see, with Bani Abbas and with every tyrant that rules, they can control you by imposing upon your body. They can control you by fear. They can control you by fear over your life or over your rizq. Their control is over your body, submission. But Ali Muhammad, they conquered the hearts of the people. And for the one that conquers the hearts is much greater than the one who imposes control over action or body. And when Bani Abbas recognized this, Ahibba'i, they decided that Imam Sadiq's life must be put to an end. He was ultimately martyred by Mansur al-Dawaniki al-La'in when they forced Imam Sadiq Ruhillahu al-Fida to consume poisoned grapes. And prior to this, there were 5 assassination attempts that were unsuccessful on Imam Sadiq Ruhillahu al-Fida. Not only did they attempt to assassinate him, at one point in time, they tried to assassinate and intimidate him. Yani, this intimidation that was supposed to lead to an assassination was supposed to be a lesson for the people in Medina. Mu'arrikhin or historians come forward and they say that Mansur al-La'in sent an army from within the secret forces of Bani Abbas, and they came to Medina in the darkness of the night, and they lit the house of Imam Jaafer as-Sadiq on fire. Imam as-Sadiq in his house in the middle of the night with his women, with his children. And to take a moment to understand this reality. A few days back, I was talking with one of the mu'mineen, and he told me his son touched the electric stove by mistake. The stove was hot. The finger of the child got burnt. The father, the child number one, he says the child is in so much agony. The screaming and the crying of the children. This guy tells me, the mu'min, this brother says to me, Sheikhuna, if you could have heard the pain and the scream, if you could have heard the pain in the crying and the screaming of my child, as a father, you could have died there. He says, my child was crying in such a manner, I had to take care of my wife first. Because the mother's heart melts over here. Subhanallah. When the child touched the stove, this Imam Sadiq's house is on fire and his children are in front of him. I've said this in previous majalis as well. To light the house on fire and to burn somebody to death is the most painful type of death. Have you seen when buildings are on fire? Person is ready to jump from the 50th floor and he would rather jump to his death rather than burn alive. You've seen in the news people from burning buildings throw themselves off the balcony. Fire is that type of adab. The narration mentions they lit the house of Imam Sadiq on fire and the house burnt down into ashes. The next day, Imam Sadiq is seen seated outside the ashes of his house with his head on his knees weeping. One of his companions come to him and they say, Abna Rasulullah, do you cry over your burnt house and you teach us that this dunya is temporary? He says to him, Abna Rasulullah, your house was burnt down, but your fathers and your grandfathers, they were poisoned and they were killed, and your grandfather in Karbala was massacred. Shahada is but a part of your grandness. Why do you weep, Ya Ibn Rasulullah? The historian mentions Imam Sadiq alayhi salam looked at the companion with tears rolling down his eyes, and he says to him, "Oh man, when our house was on fire," he says, "I was trying to put out the fires in different parts of the house with buckets of water, and I could see and I could hear my children and women scream out of fear and out of fright as their bodies got burnt, and they ran from room to room." Because these are the women of Ali Muhammad. For them, hijab, they are the hijab of Allah. As the poet says, he says, "They ran from room to room, and I watched them cry and scream with the fear and the pain of getting burnt." He says, "And at that point, I remembered the tents of my grandfather on the day of Ashura, and how the women and the children must have screamed and cried and fled from the burning tents. Because at least over here, I am here to protect my women and children, but who was there to protect Sayyida Zainab and Sayyida Ruqayya from the marauding Hajj? Over here, Yabna Rasulullah, Imam Sadiq, when your house was on fire, you were there to guide, and you were there to comfort and to take your women and children into safety. You were able to get them out of the burning house. But in Karbala, when Zainab and Ruqayya, when Sayyida Zainab and Sayyida Ruqayya came out of the burning tents, there was no one there to guide them, no one there to welcome them, no one there to hold them to safety. Rather, when they came out of the burning tents, they were met with the whips of Shimr and Umar ibn Sa'ad. The women of Ahlul Bayt say, "We came out of the running tents, we are in the Maidan." They say, "We don't know where to go. On one side, our tents are burning. On the other side are the army of Shimr. They're looking for us and snatching the earrings from our ears and whipping us on our backs. And if we run on the other side is the Maidan, the decapitated bodies of our fathers and our men. Who is there to give us refuge? Allah, Allah." This is why the narrations mention that Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam wept uncontrollably, remembering the grief of Shami Ghariban. Like this, Ya Ahibba'i, the final days, Imam al-Sadiq was forced to eat poisoned grapes that ultimately led to his martyrdom on the 25th of Shawwal. The historians mention for 3 days the effect of the poison was such. For 3 days, Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam was bedridden. He was not able to move his entire body because the first consequence of the poison was that it paralyzed the body of the Imam. And then after that, the Imam himself says, "I feel the consequence of this poison. To me, it feels as if that my interiors and my stomach have been cut by swords." The pain was such that the Imam would gain consciousness and would faint multiple times for the last 3 days of his life. On the last day, the day before his Shahada, one of the companions comes in to visit Imam as-Sadiq. He says, the companion himself narrates, "I saw Imam al-Sadiq in the state of death on the day before he was martyred," yani on a day like this. He says the effect of the poison was such that it had eaten away all the fat on the body of Imam al-Sadiq. And when I looked at him, it is as if I saw a skeleton lying on the bed with only pale skin covering the bones. Allah, Allah, Ya Imam Sadiq. The narrations mention that as the intensity of the poison continued until the time of death, Imam Sadiq gathered all his family members. Allah, Allah, Ya Shi'at Ali Muhammad. These are the final moments of Imam Sadiq's life. Imam Sadiq gathered all his family members and he began to give them the final wasiyah. From the wasiyah, he said to them, "Allah, Allah, O my family members, do not abandon your salat. فَلَا يَنَالُ شَفَاعَتَنَا مُسْتَخِفِّينِ الصَّلَاةِ. Indeed, the one who takes the salat lightly shall never receive our shafa'ah on the day of judgment. And then he took forward his son Imam Musa ibn Jaafer al-Qadim. He appointed him as the next Imam after him. He appointed him as the next Imam after him. And then he gave Imam al-Qadim the Jami', he gave him the Mus'haf, he gave Imam al-Qadim the Dhul Fiqar. And one of the traditions mentioned the inheritance of Imam al-Sadiq. He gave Imam al-Qadim a burnt and a broken piece of wood. Allah, Allah, what was this piece of wood? Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam says, we the A'imma inherit the burnt door and the wood from the burnt door of the house of our mother Fatima. We pass it on from Imam to Imam. Allah, Allah. He designated and appointed Imam al-Qadim as the Imam and the Hujjah over the entire universe and creation after him. The narrations then mentioned the poison began to take its toll. The Imam was not able to breathe that well, and the Imam was not able to move. The final moments of Imam al-Sadiq. فَإِسْتَقْبَلَ الْقِبْلَةَ وَمَدَّدَ يَدَيْهِ وَمَدَّدَ رِجْلَيْهِ. They faced Imam al-Sadiq, sleeping, facing towards the Qibla. They straightened the hands of the Imam. He straightened his legs. وَعَرَكَ جَبِينُهُ. The sweat of death began to drip down the forehead of Imam al-Sadiq. فَأَحْسَكَنَ أَنِينُهُ وَفَاضَتْ رُوحُهُ الدُّنْيَا. The Imam took a final deep breath, and then the ruh of the Imam left his body towards the heavens. رحم الله من نادى وإماما وصادقا وجعفرا. Imam Musa al-Kadhib, with great difficulty and tears, began to give the ghusl and the kafan to Imam al-Sadiq. He wrapped Imam al-Sadiq in two pieces of cloth as the kafan, and this was the same cloth that Imam al-Sadiq would wear as ihram for Hajj. He then tied an amama around the head of his father, Imam al-Sadiq. This is the amama of Imam Zainul Abidin. With great difficulty, the janazah was taken to Jannatul Baqi. Imam al-Qadim himself laid his father, Imam al-Sadiq, in the grave and began to throw the dust onto the grave. Imam al-Qadim was seated by the freshly covered grave in Jannatul Baqi, weeping, Allah, Allah. Ya Maulana, Ya Imam Jaafer as-Sadiq, your tragedy is great, but at least in your dying moments, you had your family members around you. You had your son Imam Musa al-Qadim around you. They were comforting you. Your family was around you. But Imam al-Sadiq in Karbala, at the final time, who was around Imam al-Hussein? He was on the plains of Karbala. On one side, he would look at Sayyida Zainab on the till. He would look at Sayyida Kulthum in the Khaymaga holding back Sayyida Shukaina. He was seeing Rabab and Zainab and seeing Farwa cry. All this time, Shimon was walking towards him with a khanjar in his hand, kicking him on the sides. From Imam al-Hussein, looking at Sayyida Zainab, shout from the till, Ya Adu Allah, do not attack my brother. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. Matam Hussein, Matam Imam Sadiq.
Go when you're ready.